Hi everyone, and thanks for coming to the talk. So I'm going to talk about data dashboards and visualizing data. And if I'm thinking of data dashboards, some software like this comes to my mind. I don't know about you, but I'm a software developer, and I don't really enjoy UIs like this. So I actually don't even like to use my mouse. So I prefer to use the keyboard to work, and eventually I got so annoyed and frustrated to work with interfaces like this, not specifically this software, but UIs with this many buttons and so on, that I decided I want to do something about it. So I was thinking to myself, well, I don't want to work like this. This feels slow and it feels easy to mess something up. What would be the ideal tool for me to visualize data? And I'm just thinking, well, I actually don't want to bother visualizing data at all. I just want to worry about which data am I interested in, and then I want to hand the data to the computer and let the computer do the visualizing for me. And when we're talking about getting the data we're interested in, for me, I actually like to use SQL to get data I care about. I think it's a great tool to describe which data I want to have. And so I was thinking, okay, let's explore that approach. And let's look at some SQL. How can we go from SQL to then visualizing it as some graph or something like that? And if we look at this example here, we can see we already have a separate query just to fetch the title, and then we have the actual data we want to show as a graph. And this SQL essentially describes all the data that we need to then render a graph like this. So how can a computer go from this SQL to show us a graph? Well, in theory, the computer can look at the shape of the data and know, well, this looks like something I would graph as a chart, right? But then there's not just one way to visualize exactly this data. So this chart here with the bars is great to compare the bars with each other. Here, each bar is a week, so you can compare over time. How does my data change? How do the bars change, right? But if I don't want to compare the weeks over time, but I want to compare categories with each other instead, then another chart might be better. So in that case, maybe a line chart shows me right away, like, how do the different categories compare to each other? And so somehow we have to make a decision here how we want to visualize the data, but depending on which questions we're asking. That's something the computer cannot decide for us. So how do we do that? Well, can we somehow tell the computer what kind of visualization we want and just give the computer that as information as part of the SQL somehow? And if you look at this, this might look a bit weird, but this is all just valid SQL. If you haven't seen this double colon notation here, that's basically a way to do type conversion in SQL. So when we look at the first line here, the text here, we convert it to the type label. But label here, it's not a standard SQL type, right? So we convert that type here, and underneath it's still just a text, but we defined a custom type, and that's something many SQL engines allow you to do. And the type label then underneath is a text, but it's a custom type that just describes in the type information how we would like to visualize that. And then we do that for all the other columns. And by adding this extra information, this SQL now describes how we want to visualize the data. And by just looking at the code, the computer can then do that for us, and we can encode the decision we made about how we want to visualize it. And then if we want to change it, we can just change bar chart to line chart, and then the graph would change, right? So this works. We can describe a single chart like that. But if we think back to the beginning, we were not talking about only one chart. We were actually looking at a whole dashboard. So how would we do that? Let's look at an example here. On this dashboard, you see we have a bunch of different visualizations. And basically, we could just take this and break it down. Okay, we have 5 cards here. So we can describe each of these cards with SQL the same way we did before. And that works easy enough. But then at the top, you probably saw there are some filters as well. So what happens if you want some interactive elements in a dashboard? How would you do that in SQL? Well, let's look at this drop-down to select a category. We could describe that drop-down to a computer, right? So the computer can know how that I should render drop-down somehow. Well, we have to somehow say what this drop-down should be called, and then we have to also specify which data a user can select from. And we can do that in SQL, right? We can return a list of options, and then all we have to do is somehow say this is a drop-down, and then the computer can render it as a drop-down. Now, once a user would select an option here, we somehow want to update the rest of the dashboard. So if we look just at this count here, we just calculate a count over a bunch of rows of data, and we could then filter that accordingly. So by adding a where clause, we add a filter here, and instead of hard coding some filter, we can treat the drop-down as a variable. Here we have a helper function in SQL that just refers to that drop-down category, and the same for the date picker next to it. And that way we can use SQL to dynamically define dashboards that include some interactivity. So this is basically all the elements we need to describe a dashboard like this with only SQL code. So once we have that, our workflow can look something like this, where you can open your editor of choice and then just start writing SQL. It's just code. This is actually what you see on the screen is the complete code to define this specific dashboard. And then we just need the tool on the other side that takes that SQL, runs it somehow, and shows a dashboard to us. The great thing about working like this is that now we just use our editor. It's just code. That means we can basically build dashboards the same way we build any other software. So that means we can put it in Git. We can, of course, use our editor. And we don't even have to write the code ourselves, right? It's code, so we can ask an AI agent to write it for us. And I want to work that way. It feels much simpler for me than going back to a UI to build dashboards. And now we only need that other tool that runs that code for us. And if we think about running SQL, usually that works by taking the SQL and sending it to some database, and then we get back some data, right? How would we do that here? And so this is where DuckDB comes in. So if you haven't heard of DuckDB before, you can think of it similar to SQLite. It's an in-memory database, in-process database. So it runs as a library in your applications. You don't have a separate database server that you have to connect to. Instead, you just have a library in your application that allows you to run SQL code. And interesting for us is that DuckDB cannot just query its own data, but it can query all sorts of data sources. So you can treat it as a SQL engine to then query different data sources. So you can, for example, connect from DuckDB to your Postgres database, or you can also query things that are not databases. So you can directly query CSV or JSON files, either locally or files that you have on a cloud storage like S3. And if there's any data source that you want to query and DuckDB doesn't support, DuckDB has like a flexible extension system. So anybody can create extensions for new data sources. For example, one I like to use is for Google Sheets, so you can directly connect to Sheets and query them. And that's great. With this, we can then just write SQL and query any data we like. We can put these things together, and then our code can look something like this, where we have a single select statement where we select from a bunch of different data sources. So here, S3, Postgres, a Google Sheet, we join them together, and we turn the whole thing into a chart right away. So these are basically all the pieces we need to build a dashboard. And what I talked about is not just theory. I implemented this idea. It's on GitHub. It's called Shaper. It's open source, so anybody can go and try it out. And it's actually a single Docker container you can run anywhere you like. So I prefer running this exactly where my data already is. And that way, I don't have to send my data just to analyze it to some cloud provider or something. So it's open source. You can run it in your infrastructure. And if you want to find out more, you can check out the docs. And with this talk, I just want to not talk specifically about my implementation. Of course, check it out. I'm happy to talk about it. But more in general, encourage you to think of visualizing data as code. And I think SQL is an interesting approach to do that I haven't seen explored that much before, that you directly combine your analytics code with these additions to then visualize the data. And with that, if you have any questions now or later, feel free to ask me, and thank you.